Hi, and welcome to our next junior relations video. We're going to continue our discussion on gradient. Remember from our last video, the gradient of a line is a number, and that number determines how steep the line is. The larger the number, the steeper the line. Gradient is worked out by this fraction, rise over run. The rise represents how far the line moves up or down, and the run represents how far the line moves to the left or right. Right, let's go back and recap an example from our last video. This line has a gradient of 3 over 5. What that means is I've selected 2 points on the line that pass through the grid, and I now can work out that the line rises up 3 squares and runs across 5 squares. Alright, well, let's move on to this example and let's talk about what this video is about, negative gradients. This line has a gradient of -1 over 8. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to pick 2 points on the line that pass through the grid, and we're going to now work out that the line rises down 1 square and runs across 8 squares. Now, I know it sounds a bit weird, rising down, but just think of a -1 meaning rising down. We can rise up or we can rise down. All right, so here are the two examples we've just chatted about on the same grid. The first example at the top has a gradient of -1 over 8, so it rises down 1 square and runs across 8 squares. The example at the bottom is our normal example we did in the last video, rises up 3 and runs across 5. So now we're talking about both positive and negative gradients. A positive gradient is often nicknamed uphill, because if we drive to the right-hand side, we're driving up the hill. A negative gradient is often nicknamed downhill, because as we drive to the right, we're driving down the hill. Oh, a little couple of things to remember. Please remember that 2 positives make a positive and 2 negatives make a positive, and a positive and a negative make a negative. So if I was to write this gradient, -1 over 8, that would say that we rise down 1 square and run across 8. Yep. It also could be written like this. It's not the best way, and I don't really like people who write it like this, but it could be written rising up 1 square and running to the left 8 squares. It also, and a lot of people do this, put the negative out the front, and that represents a negative gradient of 1/8. Sometimes people write the gradient with 2 negatives, and you just need to be familiar that 2 negatives make a positive. So -1 over -8 is better written as 1/8. All right, let's get into example 3. This line has a gradient of -3. Now remember, gradients must be written as a fraction. So -3 must be written as -3 over 1, because when we divide by 1, it's just the same. And now we can pick 2 points on the graph and visualize what's going on. We're rising down 3 squares and running across 1 square. Anytime you see a gradient that's a whole number, please make sure you write it over 1 to represent a fraction. Oh, what about this example? We did one of these in the last one. These are one of these tricky ones where we have decimals. This line has a gradient of -1.2. Now we don't like decimals and gradient because it's hard to figure out how far to rise down 1.2 squares. So here's a better way to tackle these tricky ones. Take it, write it as a fraction, -1.2 over 1. Now times both numbers by 10 to get -12 over 10, and then simplify it to -6/5. And then you can see when I pick 2 points, it's rise down 6 squares and run across 5 squares. All right. Last example, how do I draw a gradient of -1? Well, once again, it's a whole number, so write it as a fraction, -1 over 1. Pick somewhere on the grid go down 1 and go to the right 1, and we have a gradient of -1. All right, that's us for this video, so thank you very much for watching.